Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining me today. My name is Sturdivant, and I'm with the United States Environmental Protection Agency. I'm the Region 6 lead for the Sustainable Food Management Program. And I invited you all here today to just, in an attempt to raise awareness around an important topic that EPA is focusing on right now. And it's about our food choices. There's a reason why EPA has made food a priority, and I hope you will too by the end of this presentation. I'm going to go over the environmental impacts of our food choices and some easy things that we can do to help reduce those environmental impacts. I'm going to go over the impacts and then those examples. You know, a lot of people talk about climate change, which is super important, and we're going to talk about that too. What I feel is less talked about is water pollution. And the main source of water pollution in our rivers comes from food production, right? It's the runoff when it rains and floods. Stuff gets washed off the farms, dirt, animal waste, feces, urine, fertilizer, pesticide. It can wash off farms and into waterways and super concentrate, and it can create havoc on local economies and ecosystems. It's called nutrient pollution. And nutrient pollution remains the single greatest challenge to our nation's water quality. Nutrient pollution presents a growing threat to public health and local economies, contributing to toxic, harmful algae blooms, contamination of drinking water sources. It kills off fish and can create dead zones like the one you see there in the Gulf of Mexico. It's one of America's most widespread and costly environmental problems. And it's our food choices that can play an important role here. Okay, what else can we learn about our food choices? How about land system change? Again, I was shocked to realize that the main cause of habitat loss, biodiversity loss, species extinction, it was all, the main source is food production. You know, we use more land to grow our food than any other human activity. I was shocked by that. So again, it's our food choices that can play an important role in determining whether that land is natural habitat, rich with biodiversity and soil carbon, or are we tearing down that habitat and releasing that carbon, right? And what we use that land for can play a big pivotal role in how we address climate change because of that ability for the land to either sequester or release carbon. And so we're going to learn a little bit more about that later. So what can we do about it? Well, the EPA came out with a couple of reports that goes into more detail about the impacts and looks at specifically the impacts of our food waste, what we throw away. Let's take a quick look at those impacts. So I'm going to go over some of this information here. Here you can see represented in this loaf of bread, the white box is what we consume, the blue is what we throw away, and the resulting food waste is more than enough to feed all food insecure Americans. How do we compare to other countries though, right? Isn't food waste inevitable? Well, here it is. Per person per day, here in America, we waste about 500 grams of food. You see how we compare to other high income, middle income, and low income countries. There's a huge opportunity here, right? We're wasting way more food than other countries, and not just the food waste, but also the resources that go into making that food and the pollution associated with our food waste. Again, the United States is wasting far more. We're wasting cropland that could have been natural habitat, rich with carbon and biodiversity. We're wasting fresh water. And you can do this at home. Take this number, 151 liters per person per day, and compare that number to your water bill. You know, per person, you might be surprised to learn that you're wasting more water just in the food you throw out than your entire household. You know, we humans, we see the water go down the drain, but we don't see the water used to irrigate our croplands, right? That feed us and feed the livestock. Fertilizer, that's tied to the water pollution and greenhouse gas emissions, we're going to learn a little bit more about. So what are we throwing away? Well, here we can see in different colors, different food categories of what we throw out. Here you're looking at, for example, 4 different studies. Our report looked at a bunch of different studies. You can see here there's a slight variation in estimates, but you can see, for example, fruits and vegetables tend to be thrown out quite a lot, makes up a big chunk. But if you look at it from a greenhouse gas emissions impact, you see it tells a different story. For example, meat, poultry, and eggs. We don't throw away much of that, but the little that we do throw away represents the biggest share of emissions impact from food waste. And why is that? Well, it's because different foods have different impacts on the environment. Here you can see, for example, 4 studies that looked at the emissions impact of different food choices, right? So we have choices we can make. A similar story with fertilizer use, right? You can see here, most of the fertilizer that we waste is devoted to animal feed. And the same thing with cropland, right? This arable cropland that we're using to grow food to throw away. Most of it is being devoted to growing animal feed, right? To feed cows, pigs, and chickens. In fact, most of the cropland we have here in the United States is fed to livestock, right? Is this an efficient use of our cropland? So what can we do about food waste? A lot of different things. You can see here the emissions impact of different food waste management activities. Of course, there are other impacts and benefits from doing some of these things, like the social benefit of donating food. From an emissions standpoint, you can see prevention is where it's at. That's really the key to reducing the emissions impact of our food waste, right? Composting, of course, is way better than landfilling, right? But source reduction is where it's at. And why is that? Why is source reduction so much better than these other alternatives? It's because of where the impacts occur along the supply chain. Again, like people, they see the trucks on the road, so they think, you know what, I'll buy local. If I buy local, then surely I'm cutting my carbon footprint from my food choices, right? Now, buying local has a lot of great benefits, like social benefits, for example. But from a greenhouse gas emission standpoint, despite the level of attention it receives, transportation from farm to retail accounts for only 6% of cradle to consumer food supply chain energy use, right? It does have an impact, but it's a small impact. You can see here, by the time it gets to you, there's little you can do about it. A big chunk of emissions from food is happening at the farm level. We're talking about things like enteric fermentation from ruminant animals like cows. It's from the animal waste itself, right? The feces and urine. And it's from nitrous oxide emissions from the fertilizer that's being applied. And that's organic or chemical or manure that's being applied to cropland that's devoted to feeding livestock or devoted to feeding humans. Both types of fertilizer can result in this nitrous oxide emission. So these are the 3 main sources of emissions impact from food, not the trucks. Very interesting stuff. Surprisingly, international transportation accounted for only 3% of total emissions. Okay, how can we prevent food waste? We've collected best practices, success stories from businesses, restaurants, grocery stores, and so on. And we've just put them together in these quick little checklists. A food waste audit is a really great thing to do. We've done several of them, like this one, for example. By weight, this school was wasting a lot of rolls and mashed potatoes and a little bit of pizza. But if you look at it from an emissions standpoint, the steak finger waste was really creating the biggest impact. So interesting stuff. We have a calculator that can calculate the emissions impact of different types of food waste, right? Different types of plastics, whatever you got. We've got a fun little calculator. I can show you how to use it. EPA has a goal of trying to encourage this nation to cut food waste in half by 2030. We hope you can join us on this goal. We've got some really great graphics to help highlight the impacts of our food choices. For example, I like this kind of visual. Greenhouse gas emissions of more than 42 coal-fired power plants. That's the amount of emissions that's coming from our food waste, from the result of wasting food. And you can see here it's enough fertilizer to grow all plant-based foods for human consumption. That's just the fertilizer we use to grow our food waste. Okay, And it's enough agricultural land to cover California and New York State combined. Now, I want you to do this exercise with me for a minute. Imagine if we were able to free up that amount of land in this country and let it return to nature. Imagine how much biodiversity and carbon sequestration we could achieve just by leaving the land alone, right? Mother Nature has this beautiful ability to heal herself if we just give her a chance. It's a carbon removal machine we don't even have to build, right? We can just let Mother Nature do her thing. Okay, what else can we learn from these reports? Some key findings. I'm going to go over this first one. Even if fossil fuel emissions were immediately halted, current trends in the food system could preclude the achievement of limiting global warming. Now, let's hang on this quote for a minute. What is it saying? And this was a shock to me. Wait a minute. You're saying that if we stop fossil fuel emissions entirely, it won't be enough? Yeah, that's what I'm saying. That's what our report found. Cutting emissions from fossil fuels is no longer enough. Absolutely needed, but now not enough. We now have to address our food system as well because we've just put so much carbon into the atmosphere already. So how do we address the emissions from our food system? Let's look at this next quote. Well, many of the studies presented in this report compared a variety of strategies, including closing yield gaps, increasing resource efficiency. These are things like farming practices, they can help. Also, dietary shifts, changing your diet, and reducing food loss and waste. Now, this next part is important. It says here, finding that only in combination could these strategies achieve a sustainable agricultural future. So this is important. If we want to meet these objectives, we can't just do one of these. We've got to do all three. Farming practices, dietary shifts, reducing food waste. And among food categories, animal products require the most land, water, fertilizer, and energy, and emit the most emissions per unit of food. Okay, so what does that look like visually? Here's one of the studies that the EPA report highlighted. And you can see here a visual representation of the emissions impact from our food system and some examples of strategies that we could implement. So the way you read this chart is on the left, you see business as usual emissions from our food system. Now, this is just from our food system. Projected out into the future, you can see it burns way past our remaining budget at staying below 1.5 degrees of global warming. Remember, that's the limit that the international scientific community has come to consensus on, saying that is a boundary we should not pass if we want to continue to enjoy the stable climates that we've built our whole society upon. And you can see it even gets dangerously close to the 2-degree mark. Okay, to the right of that are strategies to help reduce those emissions. For example, you can see here plant-rich diets, right? Eat more plant-based foods, fewer animal-based foods. That can get us the reductions we need by itself, back to 1.5 degrees. Other strategies like healthy calories. We've got farming practices here in the middle, along with food waste reduction. And on the right, we see that if we do them in combination, we can really get some serious emissions reductions to get us safely below that mark. Now, remember, this is assuming that we've eliminated fossil fuel emissions, and that's a big if. If we don't tackle fossil fuel emissions, we're going to have to do even more with our food choices. Okay, so I'm going to leave it there. And this was a shock to me. I'm going to let that kind of settle in with y'all. And if you have any questions, you want me to go into more detail about any particular thing, just let me know. All right. And thanks for having me. Thanks for your time. I think this is important information. You can get in touch with me if you'd like my technical assistance in implementing some of these kind of solutions or ideas into your campus, or into your business. Please let me know. I'm here to help and provide far more resources. So please write my number and information down. Okay, I'm gonna up there. And then I'm going to look at the chat and see if we have any questions. All right. See how busy this chat is. It's not too bad. So, you know what? Let's we have some hands raised. Let's go ahead and unmute since we've got just a few people here today. Okay, it looks like Faraz is first. Let's see. I'm going to Faraz, if you want to go ahead and unmute, I think you're able to.
Yeah, I'm unmute. Yeah, thank you so much, Stephen. Really appreciate the talk. It was really eye-opening. Yeah, I'm the CEO and founder of Allied Scholars. We have chapters in different universities, and one of the things we really like to do is to work with dining halls to really more think about like dietary changes more as a way to reach their sustainability goals. Before starting Allied Scholars and working on alternative proteins, I used to work in biopharma and made therapeutics for antibiotic-resistant species and pandemics, especially influenza. But the reason I shifted towards working on dietary changes is because I realized that even local farms and backyard chicken farms, they still contribute to a lot of public health issues like influenza, for instance. But I'm curious to see, you always see all these greenwashing and labels, grass-fed, regenerative agriculture. So are these really good solutions to combat climate change or other environmental impacts of foods? Thanks.
Faraz, I think if I understand your question correctly, can farming practices help reduce emissions? And what our report found is that farming practices can definitely help reduce emissions, but farming practices alone will not be enough to help bring emissions down low enough to get us to 1.5 degrees, right? It won't get us all the way to the goal. We can't only lean on farmers to fix all of this for us, right? They're growing a commodity that we demand. And so we also play an important role here as well. Yeah.
I just heard something about like sometimes grass-fed and organic or grass-fed, their environmental impact sometimes is actually higher because they consume more resources. So I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Okay. Well, so let me go back to my PowerPoint, and so our EPA report highlighted several different studies, and some of those studies did talk specifically about this particular, different types of production methods. And so let's see if I can again share my screen and then show you something real quick as an example of one of the studies that EPA looked at. You can see here on my slides, and I'm going to share these slides with you. This is one of the studies, for example, that EPA highlighted in the report. And right here, you can see the link to the report. You can go here and for example, search it like this. And then every report has an abstract, which is super easy to read. It's very short. I encourage you, at the very least, to read the abstract of some of these papers. You can see that their authors, their academic affiliations, the journal, and you can learn about the peer review process. So really interesting stuff. The abstracts are usually very short, but if you want to dive a little bit deeper, there's like the supplemental information as well that often comes with studies. For example, you can download those, and where they got this data, right? Here's the title of the study: Global Food System Emissions Could Preclude Achieving 1.5 degrees, right? So where do they get their data from? You can see here under materials and methods. For example, the annual food system emissions. They get it from several life cycle meta-analyses, and here are some references: 8, 10, and 34, for example. So if you were to go down to the bottom here, and I'm just kind of showing you how to do this on your own. You can see here references 8, 10, and so on. So let's just take a look at this one, reference 8. I want to dive into that real quick. And this was also mentioned in our EPA report, this study here. And for example, it goes into detail about, food choices, production systems, right, which is part of your question. And so it's got some really useful, a lot of these studies have usually some really useful visuals that can kind of nicely summarize the findings. And they've got one here as an example on the emissions impact of, grass-fed versus conventional beef. And thank you for your patience. Let's see. I'm going to click on this, and it has visuals like this. You can see here grass-fed versus grain-fed. And the way you read this chart is anything above the 1 means that grass-fed environmental impact is greater. So for example, grass-fed beef, according to this study, resulted in greater greenhouse gas emissions than grain-fed, as well as requiring more land and eutrophication pollution, right? There are other considerations, of course, but from these particular environmental impacts, you can see kind of where they fall. So really interesting stuff. I really encourage you to dive into some of these studies, and they're all at the bottom of the EPA report. So I hope that helped answer your question. Let's go back to the chat. Would love to see that food emissions slide again. Okay, food source, not waste. So yeah, this is looking at food waste. If you want to look at food source, there's some great information out there. For example, you can check out the National Climate Assessment. There's a lot of great resources out there. This is just one of them. This is the 5th National Climate Assessment is the U.S. government's preeminent report on climate change impacts, risks, and responses. And in some of those chapters, food emissions, they have information about that. For example, if you go here, I think to agriculture, and you can read this chapter, and I think they have a slide as well. You can see here. Let's see if I can come to it real quick. Yeah, right here. So this is the emissions impact of different protein foods. This is per 100 grams of protein. You can see here kind of the emissions impact of a variety of different foods. For example, this is from the National Climate Assessment, the 5th report. So we've got that there as well. Okay. Another question, is there any information by the EPA or US government that talks about how dietary change can reduce emissions? So in this National Climate Assessment, they do talk about it in great detail. If you go to, I think it's in mitigation, right? The solutions chapter. See if I can get rid of that. Okay, and then if you just click on expand all, and then I think a quick way to find it is I just type in, and then here we have a section. We've got the section on reducing food waste here, and then shifting diets is also mentioned. You can read about it, and they've got some visuals of their findings as well. You can see here, for example, this is kind of like the current standard American diet. You can see how much emissions that it produces, by diet type. And here to the right, you see a variety of other different diets that were also looked at and measured for their emissions reduction potential. And you can see here, for example, the vegan diet was able to reduce production emissions by over 500. million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. And it also has the potential to sequester additional carbon in the land, right? When you shift to that diet as well. So that's some additional potential mitigation as well. And then over here, you can see the potential to reduce premature deaths from air pollution by adopting different diets. They also included that information there as well. So they have a lot of information about this and resources. But also, I would encourage you to look at the many studies that the EPA report also cited. In that report, a lot of really great studies there as well. But either report should get you a lot of information about that. Okay, Ryan, what about you? Do you have another question for us?
Yeah, if that's all right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so regarding regenerative animal agriculture specifically, are there other metrics other than total land use, which it's typically in the literature seen as worse for the environment than conventional animal agriculture? So if I'm talking to people who are proponents of regenerative animal agriculture, for example, raising cattle, and I want to mention things more than just land use, is there data on that?
Is there data on the mitigation potential of different livestock management practices? Is that kind of your kind of question?
Yeah, like I know regenerative animal agriculture is sort of a buzzword and means a lot of different things to different people, but when it's used in the literature and on studies, have they been able to measure benefits or not benefits, like worse compared to conventional animal agriculture, besides just land use? So like water use, or how does that affect water pollution, that sort of thing? For
let's see,
regenerative animal agriculture.
Yeah, if you go into the great question. And there's a lot of great resources that talk about this. I'm going to pull up the mitigation chapter again from the National Climate Assessment. So here, I hope that you're seeing some potential emission reductions, and these include a whole bunch of other stuff, all kinds of emission reduction potentials, right? And you can see all of them here. And they have things like livestock, right? You've got croplands, nitric and adipic acid production, and so on. They've got they do talk about other mitigation solutions.
Mm-hmm.
You can see them here.
Interesting.
Reforestation really helps a lot. Land restoration, crops and grazing, right? Things you can do with land carbon. So it does have some potential, right, to help reduce emissions. Like I said, changing production practices and farming practices can help reduce emissions. Now, this isn't your grass-fed beef, right? This is a very particular, uncommon livestock management practices that can help reduce emissions. You can see here it goes to about 200.
And does it adjust
million
for
metric
total,
tons?
Like total calorie input? So like say amount of calories is between the different groups, or like is it measured by like weight in terms of output of like how much food supply is gotten, and then looking at how it affects the environment?
Yeah, so a lot of these studies do a really good job at leveling the playing field and equalizing so that they are comparative, right? So they make sure that, for example, they're comparing them all by calorie or by protein or by serving. And when the EPA says that, for example, animal products require the most land, water, fertilizer, and emissions impact, they were referring to by weight, by serving size, by calorie, and by protein. Either way you look at it, it's similar across the board. It varies, right? But you can still make a general statement like that, even looking at different. And a lot of these studies, when they look at different diets, for example, they make sure that those diets all have the same amount of calories and nutrients when they compare them. That's important, right? Or else we wouldn't be able to compare them to each other. But really important question. Let's look at these two studies, for example, 8 and 10. So in this one, they have these different visuals. I'm going to pull one up for you. This is, let's see. Here we go. So this is an example of the environmental impacts of different types of foods by calorie. You can see here, by calorie, what are these impacts? And you can see this study looked at greenhouse gas emissions, land use, energy use, and air and water pollution. And you can see here at the top in green are like your plant-based foods. And then further down, you have animal-based foods like fish and beef, for example. And you can kind of see that breakdown by calorie. This other study, reducing foods environmental impacts, is also a meta-analysis, and we reference it in the EPA report. You can see here they also looked at different impacts per gram of protein, and you can see here the food's different impacts. They looked at emissions as well as land use, acidification, eutrophication, and water use. And here you can see beef. I don't know how well you can see this. Maybe I'll zoom in a little bit. What you're noticing here is there's definitely a range of emissions impact from beef production, right? I think this particular meta-analysis looked at over 38,000 farms. This is what's in our grocery stores. And you can see here there's definitely a range. It goes off the charts, right? And here's kind of the average.
Yeah.
And when you're talking about regenerative type of grazing, that's what they're talking about. They're talking about the beef herd. Now, there's also the dairy herd. And you can see here, like, the best production method that this meta-analysis found was actually from the dairy herd. So regenerative grazing doesn't apply here. And that is represented by this red line. And they kind of drew that red line down to these other protein foods that you could compare them. And you can see that, where the best production method for beef compares to, for example, plant-based protein foods, right, per unit of protein. So there's definitely a range. And like I said earlier, farming practices can help. But if we want to achieve sustainable agricultural goals, we can't just stop at production. We have to also incorporate food waste changes and dietary changes if we want to, give us, a fair shot at reaching our goals of being able to feed everybody on the least amount of resources and preventing, catastrophic climate change and nutrient pollution and biodiversity loss. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Good question. All right. Yeah, I think maybe that sums everything up. I'm just going to check real quick if people still have time. Let's see if there's any other questions out there. Yeah, people are talking about a lot of great things that other cities are doing, other campuses are doing. Yes, please check out that. And you can reach out to me. I can let you know more about what other universities are doing, what their students and dining services are doing, and I'd be happy to help connect you so that you can learn from each other. Right? That's part of helping make a more sustainable world. Right? So. Yeah, a lot more websites out there. Okay, I'm going to leave it at that. Let's call it, perhaps. Dr. Faraz Harsini, did you have one more thing you'd like to say? And we'll leave it at you, I think, and we'll call it a day.
Thank you. Just very quick, if students are interested in working with EPA to bring this education to their dining halls so that they can promote menu changes to more sustainable plant-based foods, how can they work with EPA? So that's one question I had. The second question was, is EPA doing anything about the antibiotics and hormones and other pollutants that animal farms are producing? So how are you controlling that, or trying to mitigate those issues? Thanks.
Yeah, that's a really important question. And for that, I'd love for you to email me. I can get you in touch with Randall Rush. He's our ag advisor for Region 6, and he works more closely with farms. And I'd love to get you in touch with him. He could probably enlighten you and share more information. I'm also aware that the Center for Disease Control also has made statements in the past that antibiotic resistance is a health threat and a very serious issue that should be addressed. The CDC may also have some really great information about that as well. So just email me and I can get you in touch with Randall or maybe a source at the CDC. But very important question. Many other impacts that our daily choices can have. So good important question. Thank you.
What about dining halls? So if students want to work with their dining halls to make them more plant-based, how can they work with EPA?
Yeah, sure. So a lot of your service provider, there's a lot of them out there. Maybe you have Sodexo or Aramark or Centerplate. There's a lot of them out there, and a lot of them have available for each of their locations, different menu items, different practices that they kind of leave it up to the sites, kind of what you want to pick and choose. But from what I've known, talking to these, corporate offices, they have the options there and available. It's just a matter of the location getting excited and wanting to bring these types of foods to their students. So as far as I can tell, they all have the green light to change those menus to make them more sustainable if they so choose. And I'd love to help get you connected with resources. A lot of these food service providers have resources right online on how to do this for their locations. And if your university has a private, like you handle dining services on your own, like you have even more ability to do whatever you like on your campus, right? Whether you want to collect all food scraps and compost everything and have a completely plant-based menu, like you're absolutely free to do that as a campus. So if any of these sound interesting to you and you want to learn more, please reach out to me. I'd love to get you connected with the right resources. So important question. So let's keep this conversation going. I want to help you with what you're interested in to help create a more sustainable world. So let's get to work and use me as a resource. Okay, cool. We'll leave it at that. Thank you so much for all of your time. I really appreciate you being here today. If you have any feedback, if you want to tell me how good I'm doing, if you're going to make a change as a result of this presentation, please let me know so that I can collect that and show that we are being effective. If you have any good feedback for me, I'd love to improve this presentation. So I'll leave it at that. Please reach out. You've got my email, and thank you so much for your time. Okay. I'll say goodbye for now.